Looks like we're good. Let me see. You guys see it on your end? All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to Frank Analysis. I'm your host Franco. So, what is happening in the Horn of Africa, which is comprised of Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Djibouti, and Somaliland? Well, there's been an election for Ethiopia's prime minister, as well as a conflict in Ethiopia's northern state of Tigray. Reuters just reported today that there was airstrikes that killed at least 43 people in Ethiopia's Tigray. So let me show that for everybody here. And there's also an article from the AP that talks about how Ethiopians went out to protest against U.S. sanctions over the brutal Tigray war, according to them. So we're gonna break that all down here today with the guest that I have on here, Red Sea Socialist and Philman. Thank you guys so much for coming on. How are you guys?
Hi, how are you?
Thanks for having us.
Yep. So you guys want to go ahead and introduce yourselves real quick for everybody?
Yeah, sure. You can go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll introduce myself. My name is Phil Manzarai. I'm an independent blogger. I've been active, just blogging, just different outlets. Just written for Black Agenda Report, just different independent uh, outlets. So I try to give a different perspective from the left for the Horn of Africa that is not, pushed out by the mainstream critical approach to the region itself. So that's something I provide to whoever's reading or listening.
Awesome.
Okay. Hi. I go by Red Sea Socialist on YouTube normally, but you can call me Sebs. I am from Eritrea. I so this specific issue is very close to my heart. But otherwise, I would probably just say like an independent research slash analyst person as far as like that region goes. Um, yeah.
So let's start with a bit of history. Why is there a conflict right now in Ethiopia's Tigray region?
Right now, so basically, this all started as about November 4th, November around like 3rd or 4th, when the TPLF, which is Ethiopia's former ruling party, decided to attack the main command and in the Tigray region. That is so they attacked it, and they pretty much declared. I won't say they declared war, but essentially, like that's kind of what it was. So then the federal government of Ethiopia kind of came in to quell the situation. So that's kind of how it started. And there were also rockets that had gone to Eritrea via the TPLF. I think at least 3 times. That at one point, I think Mike Pompeo even came out to condemn. Um, that's not an endorsement of Mike Pompeo, but it's just this is what happened in November. So that was kind of what sparked the situation as far as like I guess the last thing that happened or the first thing that happened that sparked it.
Okay, Philman, you want to add on a little bit more to what Red Sea said?
Yeah, I mean that is the events that led up to the November 4th attack by the TPLF. But this is a long struggle, long power struggle. There's a deep issue that has been taking shape for years as far as the within Ethiopia there has been two ruling class, the Amharu and the Tigrayan. So this is what comes to what would you call the Abyssinian kingdom. This predates the creation of Ethiopia. Ethiopia was created the same way as Eritrea was created through colonialism after 1890. So these two ruling class have had power struggle for years as the northern part. So Abiy, when he came to power, he pretty much aligned himself with the Amhara region, politically, philosophically, everything else that despite having an Oromo identity, he always aligned himself with the Amharas. So giving that background, historical background, the historical tension between the Amharu and Tigray was still growing. So in 2018, the TPLF had to pretty much withdraw from Addis Ababa and pretty much retreat to their capital region of Mekelle. This was not a transfer of power. This is pretty much a retreat. So the power struggle between TPLF and Abiy was still ongoing. It was never over. People said that TPLF was overthrown. No, there was a coup, but this was an ongoing power struggle. So a lot of people have to understand this is pretty much a long history of
Yeah,
tension between these two regions. So
indeed.
just keep that short. Yeah.
And then just to give even further context, as far as TPLF goes, they were the ruling class for about 27 years until just 2018. And yeah, so that needs to be, and they were always essentially like a client state as far as like for NATO. And even Abiy, when he came in, he was like their darling. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, which I mean, obviously doesn't really mean anything, but Obama also
Right.
won the Nobel Peace Prize. But he's a neoliberal. Like that's also needs to be kind of taken into context. He's not so much in my opinion, a revolutionary or anything like that, as far as his policies go, if we're going to be honest about it. But at the same time, um, the West still doesn't have the right to kind of impose what it is that they feel like doing,
Right.
whenever at their whim, So
And so one of the ways that the U.S. is getting involved is by financially aiding the Tigray People's Liberation Front, right? TPLF, which you guys were just talking about. Here's what one of the sources said on the Black Agenda report, discussing TPLF. Said over the years, over the last 3 decades, the U.S. showered the tribalist bourgeoisie TPLF minority regime with roughly $1 billion a year in aid under the guise of humanitarian assistance. This is generosity akin to that the U.S. Shows to Egypt and Israel, which respectively receives $1.5 billion to $3 billion annually in exchange. TPLF served as Washington's policeman in the Horn of Africa and used its influence in the African Union, which is based in Addis Ababa, to protect Washington's interests on the African continent. And Addis Ababa is the capital of Ethiopia. Think about that for 1 minute. 1.6% minority tribe in Ethiopia was exercising that much power over the whole of Africa. So would you tell us a little bit more about TPLF for people and a little bit more about what was written there on Black Agenda Report?
Yeah, I mean, to just start, I think everything was correct, but the way the individual characters issue in Ethiopia by seeing tribalism, that's incorrect. There is historical contradiction between different rulers. The Abyssinians were subjugating the Oromos in the south, who are the largest ethnic nationalities. So Ethiopia, like Lenin mentioned, and his understanding of self-determination of oppressed nationalities, Ethiopia is a prison house of nation states. The Abyssinians from the north went down to colonize and subjugate these nation states, independent nation states that were not able to do before the European started colonizing Africa. So we must understand that Ethiopia, just like Eritrea, is a creation of European colonialism. The weapons that were handed to the Abyssinians led to subjugation of the Oromos and the southern population. That's why we have this country called Ethiopia. So second, the issue of the TPLF, yes, the TPLF was supported by Washington for 28 years. It was a very compliant client regime, just the same as Paul Kagame in Rwanda, Museveni in Uganda, very compliant. They had troops in Somalia. Just when Washington asked for a assistance or an occupation of South Sudan or Sudan, they will send troops. So that's the difference. They were compliant internally originally, but the problem with Abiy is that he's compliant with the World Bank and IMF. He's not the most progressive leader. He has problematic issues with oppressing the Oromos, but he's not compliant regionally. He's not compliant to the in regards to Eritrea and Somalia and ability to pretty much not go along with the security needs of Washington for Eritrea and Somalia.
Yeah, and you can add on Red Sea if you want. If you want to
Yeah,
add on.
no, that's a good point too. It's like that is the only difference essentially. It's just a matter of like how or who their I guess their special interests are. But yeah, I mean the campaign to demonize everything that's been going on over there has been pretty hard. It's like very similar to something that what was happening like right before Syria or even Libya and things as far as just like releasing these documentaries and like every day it's like a whole plethora of just abominations. Like it makes everybody sound seem like it's just a bunch of like savage people going around committing crazy atrocities. And it's not to deny anything that's very real and that's happening over there, but it's just it's almost like cartoonish the way that
Right.
they're depicting it. So
Yeah, so let's talk about that comparison, right, with Libya, with what happened in 2011 and the campaign that the mainstream media was doing. This time, there's more pressure from the independent media to correct the narrative that the mainstream media tries to manufacture. Um, but I'm also seeing some people, some leftists that are calling like what's happening in Ethiopia like a genocide, and that the U.S. must intervene, and that we're wrong for if we don't stand up against the genocide. So, can you talk about the similarities with what happened with Libya in 2011, and do you guys see any hope in independent media and preventing something like an intervention from happening in the Horn of Africa?
Yeah, I'll just make mine brief. Yeah, I mean there's a lack of effort to pretty much take a hard position when it comes to Africa issues. This is considered an African issue, very complicated, and people fall into stereotype. This is just the usual. When you hear genocide, you're like, all right, it's just Africans. They're just killing themselves. They're backwards. This is even the independent progressive media outlets. They still hold on to this idea. And and then the example you mentioned, Libya. Yes, I think the running up to the rumors about Gaddafi taking Viagra, pretty much African militias, the savagery of his forces. This is something that was pretty much projected, and a lot of progressive media pretty much took a bite from the State Department line. That happened in Syria, but I think this is something that's different from Ethiopia. It's similar to the events that led to Yugoslavia. You know how the Serbian forces were painted negatively. They were accused of committing genocide, but that was not really the fact. 10 years later, people realized that it really didn't happen. It was something that the State Department manufactured in order to grow for NATO intervention. So Yugoslavia is a really clear example, and I recommend anybody to examine which forces were being demonized, the anti-NATO forces versus those elements. Now, I'm not trying to paint the Ethiopian Defense Forces as some type of progressive. They have their own internal issues, but that's a separate issue. But the Eritrean Defense Forces, that's a separate issue. But the Ethiopian Defense Forces, uh, we definitely have to give a nuanced understanding of all these actors inside Ethiopia and why Washington is only focused on Tigray, but they are so pretty much ignoring Yemen. What is the same? What was the selective average? Where is the moral average for Yemen? This is literally across from the Red Sea from Ethiopia. So pretty much people are starving. There's literal, you can say, a genocide that's happening in Yemen. So this is something that people pretty much disregard. Even the progressive media are ignoring it. But I keep it short.
yeah, no, that's a good point. The Yugoslavia parallel, that's actually perfect. And it's funny because, well, not funny, but interesting that I think Joe Biden was actually on the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate when they were imposing, when they decided to intervene in Yugoslavia. So
Yeah.
it's not looking good.
This is our president now.
Yeah.
He was
Yeah. Like he was
warmongering
the
back
one,
then
yeah.
in the 90s. He's been warmongering his entire time when he was
Entire time.
in Congress and the Senate. But yeah, people just expected more because they just go with the mainstream narrative, right? Like the mainstream
Yeah.
narrative paints Trump as this fascist when Biden is no different.
It's the
It's just the
same.
language that he uses. So
Actually, so the thing that I know you watch Caleb Maupin too,
mhm.
and he talks about the different factions of the ruling class. So I would definitely say like the Biden faction of the ruling class is very close to the TPLF. Like have always been
Oh,
since the Clinton years. Yes, like Susan Rice, Madeline, or what's her name, Samantha Powers, Madeline Albright too. Um, they're very close to that faction in Ethiopia. Like
is it?
since the 90s, yeah, and even Susan Rice, there was like WikiLeaks emails that revealed Susan Rice was pretty much collaborating with the old president of Ethiopia named Meles, who was the head of TPLF. She was conspiring with him essentially to put more sanctions on Eritrea back in 2009.
Do they
So
use a lot of like social issues to try to paint themselves as good people? Also, the TPLF.
that's more force, I would
Okay.
say. I don't
Yeah, I
know.
mean the
I
way TPLF was portrayed 28 years by Washington is like
Yeah,
a beacon of hope, a beacon of democracy, a beacon
yeah,
of this is a lot of GDP growth. This is Ethiopia rising. This is the narrative that was manufactured, but it was still a very successful client state. It's
yeah,
in effect to control Somalia, destabilize Eritrea, occupy South Sudan, and you got to understand, Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, when he was in power, he was very close with Bill Gates. He was very close with the Clintons. The same relationship that Paul Kagame has in Rwanda is the same relationship. He has a relationship with Suzanne Rice. He has a relationship with Samantha Powers.
mm,
All these entities are part of the Biden administration. So this is pretty much a direct line. It's factual to say that Washington directly supports the TPLF.
yes,
And I say this before we move on to like, I just want to mention that U.S. aid is really heavily present in Tigray. If you look at the rates of funding for the Tigray region by the U.S. aid over the 28 years, compare that to Eritrea. Eritrea expelled U.S. aid in 2005, making it the only African state to do so, making it the only state to pretty much reject AFRICOM. So you got these comparisons between a very compliant state versus Eritrea in the north trying to contain the TPLF, an asset of Washington. So this is the current struggle. This is a battle to pretty much neutralize Washington asset, and Washington does not like it, does not want you to touch their asset. This is what's happening right now.
mhm,
Yeah, and speaking of AFRICOM, Eritrea is the only African country that refuses to collaborate with AFRICOM, right? And then one of the sources that you sent me, Red Sea, from Rusi.org called the Tigrayan government a Marxist-Leninist control system that was developed in 2005 after the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, or the EPRDF, failed to secure any seats in the federal election. So you call yourself Red Sea Socialist, right? So is it accurate to call this government Marxist-Leninist?
no. I think they call themselves that, but no, I they just put a brand name on their form of oppression, in my opinion. They
Yeah, I
call
mean,
themselves, yeah, they call their oppression Marxist-Leninist for some reason.
Mm.
this is the same case. This is a history of the Ethiopian regime, pretty much tagging them the previous Derg regime label itself
Yeah,
Marxist. But that wasn't true. But the policy of TPLF, it pretty much conceded to IMF, World Bank, to land grabbing international multinational corporations to land grab inside Ethiopia. So you can look at the record. This is not true. They cooperated on every level toward imperialism, to advancing Washington interests of destabilizing, creating chaos. This is not Marxist. This is not something the TPLF track record is not
Mm.
pretty much like the Marxist government.
So, can you tell us a bit more about Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed? You guys mentioned that he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019, and this was for um, negotiating a peace with Eritrea, but now, like, his reputation is being tarnished recently
yeah.
because he's been sending troops over to that region, right? So, what kind of leader is he, and how have his policies affected the region?
Well, I definitely would not say that he was a progressive by any means, but like when he first came on, he's a neoliberal. Like he believed in the free market. He embraces what is it? Just the privatization, liberalization. He liberalized the telecom sector. He brought in Volkswagen from Germany to develop the auto industry. He what else did he do? He's sold off part of the Ethiopian Airlines to multinational corporations. So he's not so yeah, he's not really a bastion of hope for the people,
Mhm.
in my personal opinion. But that's just where I'm at with him.
Yeah, Seb is correct. I think the way Abiy was portrayed initially was succeeding as a neo liberal. He got the Nobel Peace Prize, which it doesn't really mean anything. You got war criminals like the Obamas getting the Nobel Peace Prize. But initially, he was supposed to be the leader that's supposed to take Ethiopia away from the Chinese influence of the 28 years. He had, pretty much these policy that Washington favor as far as privatizing, like Seb's mentioned, going along with the IMF World Bank dictates. So the only problem is when he made peace with Eritrea and made security deals with Eritrea and Somalia,
Yeah.
that it was against Washington's interests regionally.
Yeah.
You cannot. They didn't like the fact that this guy, supposed to be their guy, pulled the troops from Somalia to go attack something, an element inside. This is not something that they are hoping for. They don't want this to happen. They want the Ethiopian troops to stay in Somalia per their dictate, to pretty much occupy and be the police of the region. So
Oppress the
that's the difference
Somali
between,
people, like
yeah,
completely oppress. There's Kenyan troops there, Ugandan troops. It's a really
yeah.
rough. Somalia is a really rough place, very undercovered as well.
All the client regimes are in Somalia occupying. But the difference between the TPLF and Abiy is, he's compliant internally as far as the IMF World Bank. The TPLF was very compliant security-wise to Washington, so he's not compliant to Washington's security interests. Therefore, these efforts to demonize him. Now, we're not trying to paint him as progressive, as mentioned. This guy has a lot of baggage. He's liberal, but this is an issue of Washington trying to interfere internally to an African state, which is a problem. That's the only issue here.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So I want to show people, that AP article, just so that they can get a sense of what kind of sanctions the U.S. is trying to impose. So again, here's the article. So they write here, the U.S. said last week it has started restricting visas for government and military officials of Ethiopia and Eritrea who are seen as undermining efforts to resolve the fighting in Tigray. Home to an estimated 6 million of Ethiopia's 110 million people. Besides the visa restrictions, Washington is imposing wide-ranging restrictions on economic and security assistance to Ethiopia. So there's always some kind of geopolitical reason for the U.S. to impose sanctions on countries like these, right? So why are they getting involved?
Okay. Well, I think there's a factor, like a plethora of reasons, kind of like what Philon was saying, as far as not complying exactly with what they want him to do. Then there's also the Egypt aspect of it, where the Grand Renaissance Ethiopian, the dam, the GERD, and obviously Egypt has made it clear that they don't want that. They were able to co-opt Sudan for a while, but I think Sudan's kind of having a change of heart a little bit as of recent. But Egypt doesn't want Ethiopia to do that, even though it belongs to Ethiopia just as much as it does. It belongs to everybody. If people want to use things to power, to give power to their people, as literally power, like electricity, then I think that should be fine. But Egypt is being kind of difficult and trying to get the Arab League involved in order to pretty much have the Arab League make that decision for Ethiopia, which is like, and it doesn't make sense to me, but so there's just a lot of reasons, and of course Egypt is also a client state of the U.S. I think they receive, I think you were saying, what, 1.5 billion or more dollars for military aid alone, and Biden even called the president of Egypt just a month ago to touch base and make sure everything's okay with him. Like, while in Egypt they have 60,000 political prisoners and media repression and a bunch of other things, but those are kind of it's like, oh yeah, just Sisi, just work on that, But I don't think that he ever called Abiy or extended that same courtesy to the president of Ethiopia. So it's just kind of those types of things are kind of glaring as far as how who is is treated.
Yeah, just to add on what Seb said, I think the main factor is the last 4 years we saw Washington pretty much lose influence in the region. After 2016, we saw the protest with the TPLF. There's a lot of pressure for the TPLF. Were losing legitimacy internally within the Ethiopian people from all regions, the Oromia, the Maru. It was pretty much a unified effort to get the TPLF out of power. So Washington was facing a lot of credibility when it came to the PLF in Ethiopia. So when the Trump administration came, they were hands off. Like, I'm not trying to think the Trump administration as progressive or pretty much a force of good for the region as far as during the 4 years there was heavy travel sanctions on Eritrea, Somalia, which were
230 drones dropped on Somalia.
In addition to the bombs, yeah. So I think they were catching up. The Biden administration was trying to catch up. Return to the old previous Obama administration, pretty much trying to isolate Eritrea, make sure that they have somebody in Ethiopia that is pretty much very compliant to their regional interests, and also to make sure Somalia has pretty much a central government that will go along with the efforts to isolate Eritrea. So these are the 3 points, 3 foreign policy. In addition to that, we have to keep in mind the bigger problem of China influence in the Horn of Africa.
Oh, yeah.
There is the Djibouti base. There's a train station going from Ethiopia to Djibouti that's very important right now. If it goes to become successful, it will threaten Washington influence in the region, and China cannot have influence in a stable Ethiopia, and that's the bigger threat. And they know this in the State Department, Pentagon papers. They cannot let China have a stable Horn of Africa. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I'm glad you guys brought that up. Yeah, because the U.S. is like the competition between U.S. and China is increasing, and China right now they're currently leading the world in its development with the green revolution, and some of the minerals that they could be interested in obtaining from Ethiopia are like copper, tantalum, niobium, phosphate, and there's natural gas. So yeah, that's all through the Belt and Road Initiative, and the U.S. is going to try to stop that from happening, right?
Yeah, it's like an unfortunate proxy war victims, unfortunately.
It is pushing Abiy, the current administration, who's not pro-China, but to become more demanding of a relationship with Moscow and Beijing, as Washington keep just the pressure on him. So this is backfiring. The whole effect of trying to counter Chinese influence, Russian influence in the Horn of Africa is only backfiring. When you protect the asset that everybody's against, the TPLF, a regional police, you're gonna have the region be against you. Washington has to understand the consequences of protecting an element that is pretty much a police.
So what can people in the United States, or some of the audience members who watch this show who may be outside of that region, what can we do to help out with what's going on in Ethiopia besides sharing videos like this and sharing some of the work that you guys do? What can we do to help?
Oh man, I think that's actually pretty good as far as just taking a very a principled and nuanced stance on a lot of things, and not giving into the sensationalism, no matter which side it's coming from. From the super pro, Abiy Ahmed, and super pro Isaias, who are pretty pundits, the for these guys who are no, these people are great, and it's okay, dude, you just kind of lose credibility when you do that. Or just the super amnesty, State Department Langley line. So it's just kind of just trying to find that middle ground, and not giving into either side of the hysteria, because there's a lot.
Yeah, to just agree with Seb, I think what the first world leftists can do, or any progressive, is to pretty much, like she mentioned, is just to examine the issue and be consistent. If you saw the situation in Libya, study it, what happened, what was the media attention, what was Amnesty International saying, Human Rights Watch saying. These were elements of Washington arms to pretty much portray a conflict, calling for intervention. You obviously have to have critical thinking. I'm asking for first world leftists to not get pulled by emotions, rather than look at facts, rather than look at the sober geopolitical interests of Washington, not the emotions of individual some person just read a story about a kid on the front page. That's going to disarm you for critically thinking. That's the same thing that happened in Syria. You have countless stories about Syrian boy getting killed, and therefore we're going to call for intervention or
Right.
bombing of Damascus. This is the same thing, and the same thing that's happening with China. The situation with the Muslim population, their efforts to pretty much paint something that is not there, wild up people's emotion. And I just recommend first world leftists to have, be disciplined, use your critical thinking to pretty much analyze the situation in Africa with a scientific approach rather than let people on social media with different bots to pretty much push you to have an emotion over an issue that is very complicated. It requires digging and independent research and thinking. So
Excellent takes. Yeah, because we should be questioning everything, but especially the narrative that the mainstream U.S. media puts out. Like they're always going to try to take advantage of what's going on in all these other regions and pick these sensationalist stories to try to manufacture people's consent. Just like how you guys were pointing out, like, oh, like look at what's happening with the Uyghur Muslims in China. Look at all these people that Assad is killing, like in Syria. And then if you look closely into it, like you see, like they're leaving out a lot of pieces of evidence. They're manufacturing the truth so that they can manufacture people's consent. So people should notice that pattern that the U.S. does and apply that here to what's happening in this region of Africa.
Absolutely. And everywhere, honestly. And like, and
Yep.
not dismiss it as just like, oh, well, it's always like that there. Like Africa's always crazy. It's like, don't normalize it. It's not okay. It's not okay anywhere. Like, and it just kind of, it does seem as though there are certain, like sub-Saharan Africa is just like a complete, like a blackout as far as just like any, even whether it be indie media or of course mainstream's going to do what they're going to do. We know how they are, but it's just it does seem like it's kind of a blackout where it's like you kind of have to like constantly not you or anything, but just like try to make other people aware because they're like, oh well, it's like it's always been like that. Like the mineral wars have always happened. It's like, okay, but it doesn't mean that it's not either A, getting ramped up right now, or B, that
Right.
it's okay or normal.
Exactly. It doesn't mean that it's not being exacerbated by these Western powers.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's something that people need to be aware of is that a lot of people have been raised and brought up to believe that all these regions, all these countries in the global south, like whether it be in like Latin and South America or in Syria or these other Middle Eastern countries or in Ethiopia or other African countries, that they think that all these people are just savages. It's just how it is. And we need to like control like how they run their countries. Like, no, these people aren't savages. You're just ignorant and you're like that because that's how the US has
Exactly.
made us.
They had just had a debate today that I was watching film on, the one on French 24, and one of the guys was like, well, in Ethiopia, like they've never had democracy, so it's not like they really have anything to compare it to. And it's like, excuse me, first of all, like, have you ever had democracy in your country? Like,
They don't even know that.
geez, like it's pretty insane. I mean,
yeah, I
it's like
mean,
it's another thing. Like they'll like my last point will be because I always hear this where it's like, oh well, like whether it be Trump or it's like, oh well, he was against the war in Syria, like he wanted to get the troops out of here and there. It's like Iraq and yeah, he was against Libya. It's like, but no one says anything about AFRICOM.
Mm-hmm.
Like just silence on AFRICOM, and like that needs to stop. Like that's done because it's like unless you don't know, which okay, fine, you can learn, but if you know what that is and you speak about everything else, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, but you don't mention AFRICOM, there's a problem there. I need to know why.
yeah.
So
To just
that's
add
where I'm
on,
at.
I think the bigger issue is okay. I support all these progressive and leftist media outlets, but there's overfixation. I support Cuba. I support Venezuela, and this is important. Regions that people need to focus on, but be consistent. If you understand why U.S. aid has a certain policy to regime change in Cuba, and how it operates in Venezuela, how it operates in South America, attacking all these progressive leftist government, you have to understand how it operates in Tigray. Why is it supporting the TPLF? Or why is it operating? Why is it not operating in Eritrea? Why is Eritrea demonized by Washington? And why is there no AFRICOM in Eritrea? And these are the things. If you're consistent on like Cuba, how it's targeted, you should be consistent how Africa's top three, just because the African state shouldn't be disregarded, like Sarah mentioned.
And I mean, I guess we were talking about this the other day, but back in March, like mid-March, there were Green Berets sent to Mozambique, like American Green Berets sent to Mozambique, which are only ever dispatched when they're special ops. They're dispatched when there is like a specific thing that they're doing. And you don't really find out about it until like later on when someone gets a Freedom of Information Act, like, and it's kind of over and done with. But it's like, and no one really, except for I think Danny Jerson did a thing on Facts on the Ground with Misty and Jesse, but I just didn't really. It's like for me, it's like I see that, I don't care where it is, and I'm like, huh, like what Green Berets, like like what do they do? It's like so it's in, but just kind of like silence.
Yeah, that's definitely a source people should check out too. He does amazing work, Danny. He's talking about that on Soul News Day also.
Yeah, on Soul News Day as well.
And Philman and Sebs, aka Red Sea Socialist, thank you guys very much for coming on. I learned a lot. I know the audience learned a lot also. Like, this is something that's not talked about enough. So I really thank you guys for coming on the show and educating us about what's going on in that region of Africa. Thank you guys very much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Everybody else, stay informed.